Bridging Worlds. Thanks for that, Rob, because that's kind of really the perfect frame for talking about peyote in the 1890s, because this was the decade when, after thousands of years of indigenous use, peyote had its first encounters with Western science, at the end of which the first major psychedelic, mescaline, was isolated. And during the course of these encounters, peyote was approached in many different ways, from indigenous Americans, kind of bridging then via ethnography of disciplines encompassed in very few years. And in every case, except for one interesting one, all these engagements were via self-experiment. So this is basically a science of trip reports, but each one has a very different lens, very different agenda, very different focus of attention. So this is where it starts, really, with James Mooney. James Mooney is a ethnographer at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., a man with incredible knowledge of Indian languages and Indian culture, mostly self-taught. And he was out in the American Southwest this time in 1890. So this is the period immediately after the end of the Indian Wars, the Battle of Wounded Knee, the period where the main sort of American government initiatives are all around settlement and developing the reservations and the missions. So Mooney is very much working against the grain, because everybody else out there is sort of working on assimilating Native Americans into mainstream American culture with everything that entails. Mooney, by contrast, was one of a handful of people who was trying to do the opposite, who was racing to gather and to record and to preserve Indian languages and traditions and ceremonies before they disappeared. So he found himself witnessing the ghost dance, which was this huge millenarian movement of trance possession ceremonies which rose and fell through the southern tribes in the 1890s. Mooney wrote the book on that, which is fantastic. And he was then found himself among the Kiowa people in what's now Oklahoma, and came across the peyote ceremony for the first time. The peyote ceremony was quite a recent arrival in this part of the world. It was only really in the 1880s that it had started to diffuse up into the sort of southern plains tribes. And Mooney spotted its potential for regenerating these shattered communities and forging a new pan-tribal identity. So his work is really kind of advocacy for peyote as against all the other material that's coming out of the Indian Bureau and the other government agents, you know, in which once they discover the peyote, it's just seen as a drug habit, an intoxication, something that has to be wiped out before the Indians can be civilized. So this is the tone of Mooney's reportage on peyote. He says, so numerous and important are its medical applications, and so exhilarating and glorious its effect, that it's regarded as the vegetable incarnation of a deity, and the ceremonial eating of the plant has become the great religious rite of all the tribes of the southern plains. Mooney stresses particularly the medical applications of it, I think probably because he figures that this is the way to get the scientific community interested. So he says the Indians regard the mescal and peyote are used interchangeably at this point. As a panacea in medicine, he's seen it used without ritual, not in a magical context, just as a plant medicine for fevers, for headaches, for chest pains. Somebody who he thought was dying of tuberculosis, he saw revived by it. So he's interested in bringing it back for analysis and medical use. So he has to engage with it. He has to figure out his way of engaging with it, and this is what he writes. He says, I know from experience that the mescal is a powerful stimulant. During my first all-night attendance at the ceremony, I ate none, as I didn't feel sure that I could keep my brain clear for observation otherwise. And the result was that from cold, numbness and exhaustion, I was hardly able to stand on my feet when it was over. Since then, I've always taken 3 or 4. I've never felt the full mental effects of the plant. Having eaten only small quantities, I've experienced enough however, to be satisfied that what the Indians say of the mental effect is true. So Mooney's been thinking quite closely about his scientific remit. He can't get so off his head that he can't record what's going on, but he would also be derelict in his scientific duty if he didn't sample it, if he didn't sort of develop some idea of whether what it was doing for the people around him, is this some kind of placebo, was it a cultural effect? No, he established that it wasn't, that this physiological effect is real. So Mooney, after the ghost dance, is very keen on the idea that peyote is going to turn into this pan-Indian ritual with Christian syncretic elements. It's going to be a kind of new religious movement that's going to enable the Indians to maintain their culture and maintain their religious traditions. This view is by no means shared by all Indians, but he does find common ground with some people, and particularly and most importantly with Quanah Parker, who is the leader of the Comanche people in the reservation and a very formidable and influential figure. Mooney describes him as smart and shrewd and capable. He tells a great story of how after Quanah stayed up all night with a peyote ceremony, eating 30 peyote buttons, he went like straight out the next morning and did a really serious deal with some Texas cattlemen. And as Mooney says, anybody who knows Quanah knows that he would not go into a situation like that unless he was, really sort of mentally alert. Quanah called Mooney the only white man who understands our religion. So this is really the transmission is between these two people, and literally it's also the transmission because Mooney buys a big bag of peyote buttons from Quanah and takes them back to Washington for scientific experiments. So Prentiss and Mooney are the professor and his assistant in the medical department at Columbian University in Washington, D.C. And they're the people who run the first human trials on peyote with volunteer subjects in student rooms with medical supervision, starting off with 3 buttons and more if they want them. And the first trial is a fantastic success. The subject writes that after he took the peyote and kind of lay down on the bed, there followed a train of delightful visions such as no human being ever enjoyed under normal conditions. An ever-changing panorama of infinite beauty and grandeur, of infinite variety of colour and form hurried before me. My pleasure so far passed the more ordinary realms of delight as to bring me to that high ecstatic state in which our exclamations of pleasure become involuntary. We've all been there, at least I hope we have. But subject number 2 could not be more different. He didn't write a report, but the doctors noted that in his case, a marked symptom was a great feeling of distrust and resentment which he exhibited towards those who were making the experiment with him. He realized his mental inferiority and firmly believed that we were secretly laughing at his condition. He believed that we were intending to kill him. Later, the subject wrote that he believed that peyote had made him perfectly insane. So this is, it's interesting that we run straight into what is a major problem for pharmacy. One of the basic assumptions of pharmacy is that drugs do the same thing to every subject. And even in psychopharmacy, where the mind is much more in play, amphetamines are not like a stimulant for some people and a sedative for other people. The idea that this drug can have such very different effects is very, very hard to fit into that grid. And this got harder as the experiments went on. The third subject had a very intense physical effects, lost all muscle power and was recorded as being unable to walk without assistance. The fourth one had no visions to speak of, nothing much happened. The fifth one just drummed on the table for hours, saying this was making the visions kind of so much more intense. Prentiss and Morgan recalled the Indian ceremonies and thinking maybe this is why this happened. James Mooney's comments on these experiments are very interesting. Nowadays, of course, we have the conceptual framework of set and setting. But it's interesting to note that at the very, very beginning of this was really obvious to some people at least. Mooney said of the second subject, the one who had that sort of paranoid bad trip, he said, "Such feelings are entirely foreign to my own experience or that of any Indian with whom I've talked. It must be remembered that the Indian is familiar with the idea from earliest childhood and comes to it for the first time with his mind filled with pleasant anticipation. In all experiments, we must consider also the difference between Indian life with its comparatively regular routine and freedom from worries, and the civilized life with all its stress of thought and irregularities of habit. So it was really obvious right from the beginning that psychedelics pose very particular problems for scientific research and the clinical method, that they impose constraints and indeed distortions on what it's trying to observe. There was one doctor who Prentiss and Morgan were really keen to get to try peyote. This was WEIR Mitchell, who was at this point the US's leading neurologist. At the end of a long career, he'd started in the Civil War, being a specialist in nerve damage. He was the first person, for example, to describe phantom limb syndrome. He was now 67, heading towards retirement from a very distinguished and lucrative private practice as a nerve doctor. He'd been involved in toxicology for a long time. He'd done a lot of early work on rattlesnake venom, but he'd always been particularly interested in drugs, chloral hydrate, opium, ether, and like a lot of doctors of his time, he was a self-experimenter. So he had, for example, frozen his nerves just to see what happened to the sensations. He once spent a day in a straitjacket just to see that, well, that was going to be like much more horrible than he thought it was going to be. And on top of all this, he was a best-selling historical novelist with fantastic powers of description. So Mitchell made a decoction of about 8 peyote buttons and laid down in a darkened room. And then he wrote, "The display which for an enchanted 2 hours followed was such as I find it hopeless to describe in language. I was critically attentive, watchful, interested and curious, making all the time mental notes." So he's sort of scientifically engaged. But then his description is wonderfully florid. I heard approaching rhythmical sounds, and then on a beach, which I knew to be that of Newport, rolled in out of darkness, wave on wave, liquid splendors, huge and threatening, of wonderfully pure green or red or purple. These water hills of color broke on the beach with myriads of light. But he's at the same time, he's a neurologist and he's looking for neurological correlates here. So he's trying to figure out what the physiological mechanism might be. So he writes things like, "The effect on me was more or less like what was experienced in some ophthalmic migraines, zigzag lines of very bright colours." Interesting to contrast that with more recent neurologists like Oliver Sacks, who wrote books, of course, on migraine and on hallucinations and connected the two. But beyond that, Mitchell could see, there was a lot more, and it was really this was going to be most interesting in a kind of area of depth psychology. For the psychologist, he writes, this agent should have value. To be able, with a whole mind, to experiment mentally upon such phenomena is an unusual privilege. Here is unlocked a storehouse of glorified memorial treasures. So he's interested in where these visions come from, who sees what and why. He said, "No one has told us what visions come to the red man." Politically incorrect language, but a very important point. "I should like to know if those of the navvy would be like those of the artist, and above all, what those born blind could relate." But on top of this, Mitchell also found the experience very physically unpleasant. He wrote, "These shows are expensive. For 2 days I had headache, and for 1 day a smart attack of gastric distress. The experience, however, was worth 1 such headache and indigestion, but was not worth a second." So Mitchell passed on his second dose to probably the other most famous mind doctor in America at the time, William James. James, at this point, was professor of philosophy at Harvard. He and Mitchell went back a long way, but they had very different orientations. Mitchell much more interested in the physiological basis of these experiences. James developing a pluralist psychology, which aims to encompass dimensions beyond the material. So James also very interested in drugs because, they're good, solid, material, repeatable experimental agents for generating the kind of religious and spiritual experience that science is very bad at looking at. But all we get from James was this: "I had 2 days spoiled by a psychological experiment with mescal, an intoxicant used by some of our southwestern Indians in their religious ceremonies. WEIR Mitchell sent me some to try. He himself had been in fairyland. I took 1 bud 3 days ago and was violently sick for 24 hours. I'll take the visions on trust." But James, of course, did have his drug epiphany that he was seeking the following year with nitrous oxide, which provided the insight for the core of varieties of religious experience, the famous passage in which he talks about our normal waking consciousness, rational consciousness as we call it, is but one special type of consciousness. Whilst all about it, parted from it by the filmiest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different. So this pioneers, I think, a new type of engagement with psychedelics, and which probably, reaches fruition really half a century later in the most famous Mescaline experiment of all, Aldous Huxley's and Doors of Perception. Mitchell's report on peyote was very widely circulated and published, including in the British Medical Journal. And it was there that HAVELOCK ELLIS read it in London. He was interested enough to see if he could get hold of some peyote in London. He found a pharmacist who would supply it, Potter and Clark in Artillery Row, unfortunately no longer in business. And had what was the first trip in London on a major psychedelic in the rooms in the temple that he was living in, Arthur Symons' rooms. Mitchell was a qualified doctor, but he was also best known as a literary and art critic and as a social reformer. After his experience, he wrote up quite a brief piece for the Lancet on the sort of physiological aspect of the experience, and then, having cleared the decks on that front, he wrote a much, much longer piece in the Contemporary Review, which was a sort of, progressive literary journal, called Mescal, A New Artificial Paradise, in which he sets out the history and the ethnography of peyote up to this point, and then, a very lengthy and fascinating report on his own experience. One of the things that's so interesting, I think, is that having done his duty to medicine by writing it up for the Lancet, Ellis is free to treat this pretty much entirely as an aesthetic experience. And his trip report reads like a kind of review, like a work of art criticism quite a lot. So, for example, there was always a certain parsimony and aesthetic value in the colours presented. I was further impressed not only by the brilliance, delicacy and variety of the colours, but even more by their lovely and various textures: fibrous, woven, polished, glowing, dull, veined, semi-transparent. He compares it to Maori designs and to the delicate architectural effects as of lace carved in wood, which we associate with the Mukrabier work of Cairo. So what's interesting, I think, through this sequence of experiments is you just get increasingly precise descriptions of the visual effects of peyote. I think, it's interesting at this point to summon the idea of the Great Divide developed by Walter Ong in his work on orality and literacy and the transition between oral and literate cultures. So the theory is that modern Western culture is peculiarly ocular-centric, that after the Renaissance and the arrival of print, we started to privilege vision over the other senses in a way that we hadn't before and aren't privileged in other cultures. Along with that comes certain other privileges: objectivity over subjectivity, individuality over the communal, and so on. And I think there's some truth to this, and we continue to see this. The word psychedelic is an obvious example. That pretty much means in the wider culture, refers to a visual style. And even kind of within psychedelic trip reports, the visuals are very much up front, even though, it's perfectly obvious that, what's going on visually is often the least of it. And I think this makes a very interesting contrast. I mean, with years of indigenous peyote use, there's very little in the way of descriptions of visions. In most indigenous traditions, the visions are not regarded as the most important thing, and in fact, there's a bit of a presumption against sharing them. They're a private gift. But I think more specifically to Ellis's period and to the 1890s in general, this is a time when novel visual illusions are absolutely everywhere in mass popular culture. You've got photography, you've got kind of magic lanterns and illusions, you've got cinema just starting, electricity, X-rays. Ellis describes the effects of peyote, a very nice phrase, as a kind of visual hyperesthesia. You could apply that same phrase to the culture that he was in and the culture that we're still in now, where you've got all these visual novelties kind of working their way through the culture in a context that's kind of part science and part entertainment and part personal journey. So this is the final experiment in the sequence. It's the one that's probably best remembered in kind of psychedelic science today. Obviously, as soon as peyote came to the attention of Western science, pharmacists and chemists started to be interested in what the active principle was. And this had started a bit before Mooney's encounter, actually, in 1888, with the Berlin psychopharmacologist Louis Lewin, who was sent a sample of peyote buttons by Park Davis Pharmaceutical Company to see what he could make of them, if there was what the drug was in there. And over the years, Lewin had isolated lots of different alkaloids, lots of different resins. It wasn't clear which was the one that was having this dramatic effect. Lewin was kind of the leading drug specialist of the period. You might be familiar with his book Fantastica, which he wrote in the 1920s at the end of his career. A big sort of survey of psychoactive plants and drugs. He was very broad in his interests beyond chemistry. He was very interested in the history and the culture of these substances. He did lots of pioneering work, for example, on kava in Polynesia. He was a very progressive figure. He was a member of the Berlin Jewish Society, so quite a proud outsider at that time. Very independent. He lectured at the university. His lectures were incredibly popular, but he didn't teach there. He didn't have anything to do with it. He had his own private laboratory. People came from all over the world to work with Lewin in his lab. Arthur HEFFTER, by contrast, a very provincial figure, much more narrow in his interests. He'd started in agricultural chemistry and then moved into biochemistry, looking at the synthesis of lactic acid and things like that. But he did one thing that Lewin wouldn't do. Lewin would never self-experiment with drugs. And he wrote about this later in his career. And he'd started in the 1870s, Lewin, by doing some of the pioneering work on morphine addiction and sort of first descriptions of that. And he wrote, "I have known men who first took a narcotic remedy from pure curiosity and later, overcome by its influence, became habitual drug takers." So he would never go there. So he was stuck with all his extracts and his alkaloids, just giving them to dogs and trying to figure out if the dogs were having visions or not. HEFFTER kind of went straight there and fractionated out all the alkaloids from the peyote and took a dose of all of them. And he wrote of that, "I have predominantly images of kaleidoscopic figures, patterned carpets and cloth, luxurious articles of clothing and architectural scenes. The peculiar effects of peyote on the visual apparatus must therefore be produced by one of its alkaloids." He found 5 alkaloids. He named them all after different names. There's some peyotine, the one he was particularly interested in, he'd called mescaline. And he worked his way up with that from a small 20 milligram dose up to 150 milligrams, at which point he wrote, "At first there are violet and green spots which are not well defined. Then come images of carpet patterns, ribbed vaulting, etc. The results described above show that mescaline is exclusively responsible for the major symptoms of peyote or mescal poisoning. This applies especially to the unique visions." So here we've crossed another great divide, something that had been for thousands of years a divine spirit in a cactus is now a chemical in a laboratory. And I think it's kind of fitting that this is the way that this story concludes, because of the way in which it's obvious to everybody, wherever they're coming from, whatever they're looking for, that self-experimentation is the obvious strategy, that this is the place to start. And it's the starting point for multiple completely different disciplines. HEFFTER's idea of those disciplines was this: physiologists and experimental psychologists should find work in this field rewarding. It's very likely that we're dealing with an action on the central nervous system. So, there's a lot more to say, obviously, about each of these episodes. And I think there's a lot to say about the way in which this connects or doesn't connect to psychedelic science today. I think they're in many ways completely different. I think in many ways this is a much richer engagement. And I've kind of stressed self-experimentation because I think maybe that's at the centre of that. But to try and join the dots, I'll finish with a final quotation from a more recent source. This is Alexander Shulgin talking about what it's like to synthesize a new psychedelic compound, and talking in terms that I think resonate very much more with this story than a lot of psychedelic science today. Shulgin, of course, always self-experimented. Looking at these fine white crystals, he wrote, is in one way like looking at a newborn baby. True, I know the structure of the compound and its obvious physical properties, but in no way do I really know the chemical. I must begin to interact with my creation by employing a mixture of caution, curiosity, and excitement. Thank you.